The morning of October 10th, 1911, broke gray and still over the hills of Moore County, Tennessee. A thin mist hung low in the hollows, drifting through the cedars and limestone bluffs that had shaped this land for centuries. In Lynchburg, a town of barely 300 souls, the streets remained quiet. Farmers moved slowly toward their fields. Shopkeepers swept their porches in silence. And in a modest two-story house near the center of town, Jasper Newton Daniel lay dying. He was 61 years old, perhaps 62. Even this fundamental detail, his age, his birth, remained a matter of quiet dispute, a small mystery folded into the larger enigma of the man himself. What was certain was this: the figure who had built one of the most recognized whiskey operations in the American South, who had won international medals and cultivated a reputation for uncompromising precision, was slipping away. His body had been failing for nearly 5 years. The decline had been slow, then sudden, then slow again, a pattern that those closest to him had learned not to question aloud. The official cause, when it came, would be listed simply: blood poisoning, complications from an infection. But the story behind that infection had already begun to circulate through Lynchburg in hushed tones, passed between neighbors and workers at the distillery, with the careful ambiguity reserved for things that are known but not entirely understood. The account most often repeated went like this. One morning several years earlier, Jack Daniel had arrived at his office before dawn, as was his habit. He approached the iron safe where he kept his most important documents: ledgers, contracts, records of transactions that traced the careful architecture of his business empire. He reached for the combination, and he could not remember it. What happened next became the foundation of a peculiar legend. In a moment of frustration, loss of temper, some said, though others insisted the word did not fit the man they knew, he kicked the safe. The blow struck his left foot. The toe was injured. At first it seemed a minor wound, the kind of small violence men inflict upon themselves in moments of irritation and then forget. But the wound did not heal. It festered. It spread. And over the months and years that followed, the infection crept through his body with a patience that seemed almost deliberate, consuming him by degrees. By the autumn of 1911, the man who had once walked the distillery grounds with meticulous attention, inspecting every barrel, every drop, every detail of his operation, could no longer stand. The foot had been partially amputated. The poison had moved into his blood. His physicians could do nothing more than manage his comfort and wait. Those who visited him in those final weeks would later speak of a man who said very little. Jack Daniel had never been given to excessive conversation. His silences were famous, a trait that some attributed to wisdom and others to something harder to name. But in those last days, the silence deepened. He received visitors with a nod. He looked out the window at the hills he had known all his life. He did not, according to any account that survives, speak of the safe. He did not speak of regret. The town waited. The distillery continued its work, the copper stills producing their slow alchemy as they had for decades. The workers moved through their routines with a heaviness that went unspoken. And on that gray October morning, surrounded by a handful of relatives and associates, Jack Daniel died. The news spread quickly through Lynchburg, then outward to Nashville, to Memphis, to the cities where his whiskey had built its quiet reputation. Obituaries appeared in papers across the region, praising his business acumen, his dedication to quality, his role in shaping Moore County into something more than a forgotten corner of rural Tennessee. But beneath the public mourning, questions lingered. Questions that the official story did not quite answer. Why had a man so famously disciplined, so meticulous in his habits, forgotten the combination to his own safe? Why had a minor injury been allowed to progress so far before treatment? And why, in all the years of his decline, had Jack Daniel offered no explanation, no account of what had happened that morning in his office? The silence surrounding his death was not unusual for the time and place. Men of his generation did not discuss their vulnerabilities, but the silence felt, to some, like something more. A door closed, a final act of control. The funeral was held 2 days later. The procession moved through Lynchburg beneath a pale autumn sky. He was buried in the town cemetery, his grave marked by a stone that would become, in time, a site of pilgrimage for admirers of his whiskey and his legend. But the man beneath that stone remained, as he had been in life, largely unknowable. A figure of discipline and secrecy, a builder of something that would outlast him, and a man whose end had come, improbably, from a single kick delivered in a moment no one else witnessed. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. The land itself came first. Before the man, before the whiskey, before the legend that would attach itself to this remote corner of Tennessee, there was the land, and the people who scraped their lives from its unforgiving soil. Moore County lies in the southern middle portion of the state, a region of rolling hills and deep hollows, carved by centuries of water moving through limestone. The caves that honeycomb the bedrock hold springs of unusual purity, water filtered through ancient rock and emerging cold and iron-free. The Cherokee had known these springs. The first white settlers, arriving in the late 18th century, recognized their value, and by the early 19th century, the hollows of what would become Moore County had begun to attract families seeking land, independence, and distance from the authorities who might question how they made their living. Into this world, sometime around 1849 or 1850, Jasper Newton Daniel was born. The exact date remains uncertain. Records from rural Tennessee in that era were incomplete, often contradictory, and the Daniel family itself seemed to possess no clear account of when their youngest son had entered the world. Some documents suggest September of 1849. Others point to 1850. Jack Daniel himself, in later years, offered little clarification. Whether this ambiguity was a matter of genuinely lost information or a deliberate choice to obscure his origins, no one can say with certainty. What is known is that he was the 10th of 13 children born to Callaway Daniel and his wife Lucinda Cook Daniel. The family was not wealthy. Callaway Daniel worked as a farmer and occasional storekeeper, struggling to support his large family on land that yielded modest returns. The Daniels were Scots-Irish in origin, part of the Great Migration that had carried thousands of Presbyterian families from Ulster through the ports of Philadelphia and down the Appalachian valleys into the hill country of Tennessee and Kentucky. They brought with them a culture of independence, self-reliance, and a deep familiarity with the art of distillation. Whiskey making was not merely a trade in this world, it was a form of currency, a means of survival, a way of converting grain that might rot in storage into a product that could be transported, sold, or bartered. Nearly every farm of any size in Moore County possessed a still. The practice was so common, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that it carried no particular stigma. A man who made good whiskey was respected. A man who made exceptional whiskey was remembered. But young Jasper Newton Daniel would not learn the craft from his father. His mother, Lucinda, died when he was still a child. Some accounts say he was no more than 3 years old. The loss fractured something in the family. Callaway Daniel remarried, and the household that followed was, by most accounts, an unhappy one. The boy who would become Jack Daniel found himself unwanted in his own home, a surplus child in a family that had too many mouths and too few resources. The details of what happened next are obscured by time and conflicting testimony. What seems clear is that sometime before his 10th birthday, Jack Daniel left his father's house. Some versions of the story suggest he was sent away. Others imply he ran. A few accounts mention a period spent with a neighboring family or a brief apprenticeship that did not take. But the trajectory of his childhood pointed consistently in one direction, away from the family that had failed to hold him, and toward something he would have to build for himself. The landscape that surrounded him during these years would shape everything that followed. The hollows of Moore County were places of shadow and secrecy, where a man could disappear into the cedar breaks and limestone caves and conduct his business far from prying eyes. The springs that emerged from the rock were renowned for their quality, their consistent temperature, their freedom from the minerals that tainted water elsewhere. And the community that had grown up around these hollows was one that valued discretion, that asked few questions, that respected a man's right to make his own way without interference. It was a world perfectly suited to the production of whiskey. And it was into this world that Jack Daniel, still a child, would find his first true teacher, a man whose influence would set the course of his life and whose own story would eventually be submerged beneath the legend of his famous pupil. The hills kept their secrets, the springs ran cold and pure, and a boy without a family began to learn a trade that would make him in time one of the most recognized names in American commerce. But the cost of that transformation, the losses, the silences, the careful erasures that would mark his path, was already being accumulated, debt upon debt, in a ledger that would not come due for decades. The man who would teach Jack Daniel the secrets of whiskey was a Lutheran preacher named Dan Call. He owned a farm in the hills near Lynchburg, land that included one of the purest springs in Moore County and a small but productive still house. Call was a figure of apparent contradictions, a minister who made his living from distillation, a man of God who trafficked in spirits. But in the culture of mid-19th century Tennessee, no contradiction existed. Whiskey was sustenance, commerce, medicine. Its production was as natural as planting corn or raising hogs. And Dan Call, by all accounts, produced whiskey of exceptional quality. How Jack Daniel came to live with Call remains a matter of some uncertainty. The most common version of the story holds that the boy arrived sometime around 1857 or 1858, perhaps as young as 7 years old, perhaps slightly older. Some accounts suggest he was taken in as an act of charity, a homeless child given shelter by a Christian man. Others imply a more pragmatic arrangement, an extra pair of hands in exchange for room and board. Whatever the circumstances, the result was the same. Jack Daniel entered the household of Dan Call, and his education began. But Call was not the only teacher. Working at the still house was a man named Nathan Green, known to most as Nearest. He was enslaved, the property of Dan Call, and he was by all evidence a master distiller of remarkable skill. The process of making whiskey, the selection of grain, the management of fermentation, the precise control of temperature during distillation, the patient art of aging, required knowledge that could not be learned from books. It was passed hand to hand, generation to generation, a craft tradition that existed largely in the minds and muscles of those who practiced it. And Nearest Green possessed this knowledge in full measure. The boy watched. He learned. He absorbed the rhythms of the still house, the smell of fermenting mash, the sound of liquid dripping from the copper worm into waiting vessels. He learned to read the temperature of the mash by touch, to judge the progress of fermentation by scent, to recognize the precise moment when the distillate running from the still shifted from foreshots to hearts to tails. He learned the importance of the limestone water, its mineral-free purity, its constant temperature emerging from the cave spring. And he learned, perhaps most importantly, the process that would later distinguish his whiskey from all others: the slow filtration of fresh spirit through beds of sugar maple charcoal, a technique known as the Lincoln County process. This method was not Jack Daniel's invention. It had been practiced in the region for decades, perhaps longer. But Nearest Green understood its application with a precision that bordered on artistry. The charcoal mellowed the harshness of new whiskey, removed impurities, imparted a smoothness that aging alone could not achieve. The process required patience. It could not be rushed. A single batch might spend days filtering through 10 feet of charcoal before it was deemed ready. And the boy who would become Jack Daniel learned to wait, to trust the slowness, to resist the temptation to cut corners in pursuit of faster profits. The years of apprenticeship unfolded in the rhythms of agricultural life. Seasons turned. Corn was planted, harvested, ground into meal, cooked into mash. The still operated when there was grain to process and ceased when there was not. Jack Daniel grew from a child into an adolescent, his small frame never gaining much height. He would remain a notably short man throughout his life, barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, but his knowledge deepened with each passing year. By his early teens, he understood the whiskey-making process as well as any man in Moore County. Then came the war. In 1861, the tensions that had been building across the American South finally erupted into open conflict. Tennessee was divided, its population split between Union sympathizers in the east and Confederate loyalists in the middle and western portions of the state. Moore County lay in contested territory. Young men marched off to fight. Farms were abandoned or stripped of their resources by passing armies. The structures of ordinary life collapsed. What Jack Daniel did during these years is not entirely clear. He was too young to fight when the war began, perhaps 12 or 13 years old. By the time he reached an age when military service might have been expected, the Confederacy was already crumbling. Some accounts suggest he spent the war years continuing his work at the Call Farm, keeping the still house operating as best he could amid the chaos. Others hint at darker possibilities: wartime profiteering, dealings with soldiers from both sides, the kind of moral compromises that men made to survive in a world turned upside down. But no definitive record survives. The war years, like so much else in Jack Daniel's early life, remain shrouded in silence. What is certain is that when the conflict ended, everything had changed. The institution of slavery was abolished. Nearest Green was now a free man, and Dan Call, facing pressure from his congregation to choose between his ministry and his distillery, made a decision that would alter the course of American commerce. He decided to sell. The transaction that followed would become one of the founding myths of American whiskey. Sometime around 1866, Dan Call transferred ownership of his distillery operation to Jack Daniel. The precise terms of the sale, the amount paid, the conditions attached, the role that Nearest Green may have played in the transition, are lost to history. What survives is the outcome. A young man, perhaps 17 years old, perhaps younger, became the proprietor of his own whiskey-making operation in the hills of Moore County. The timing was propitious. The end of the Civil War had left the South in ruins, but it had also created opportunities for those with the resourcefulness to seize them. The demand for whiskey, suppressed during the war years, surged as soldiers returned home and the grim work of reconstruction began. Men who had seen too much sought oblivion. Communities shattered by conflict sought the familiar rituals of gathering and drinking together. And the federal government, desperate for revenue to pay its war debts, began imposing taxes on distilled spirits, taxes that would reshape the industry in ways no one fully anticipated. Jack Daniel registered his distillery with the federal government in 1866, making it, by some accounts, the first registered distillery in the United States. This claim would later become central to the brand's mythology, though historians have questioned its accuracy. What is beyond dispute is that Daniel understood, earlier than most of his competitors, the importance of operating within the law. The hills of Tennessee were filled with distillers who evaded the tax collectors, who operated their stills in secret hollows and sold their product through networks of trusted intermediaries. Many of these men would spend their lives playing cat and mouse with federal agents, their operations perpetually vulnerable to raids and seizures. Jack Daniel chose a different path. He paid his taxes. He maintained his records. He submitted to inspections and complied with regulations. This decision was not born of any particular reverence for federal authority. He was, after all, a product of a culture that viewed government interference with deep suspicion. But he recognized that legitimacy offered advantages that outweighed its costs. A legal distillery could operate openly. It could ship its products across state lines without fear of confiscation. It could build relationships with distributors and retailers who would not risk their own businesses by dealing in contraband. And it could, in time, build a reputation that extended far beyond the hollows of Moore County. The site he chose for his expanded operation was a place called Cave Spring Hollow, a narrow valley where limestone bluffs rose on either side and a spring of exceptional purity emerged from the rock. The water that flowed from this spring was cold, a constant 56 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, and free of the iron and other minerals that gave lesser water supplies their harsh metallic taste. Jack Daniel understood that water was the foundation of great whiskey. Everything else, the grain, the yeast, the charcoal, the barrels, could be controlled, adjusted, improved. But the water was given by the land itself, a gift that could not be replicated or manufactured. He built his operation around that spring. A still house went up, then a warehouse for aging barrels, then a rickyard where sugar maple was burned down to charcoal for the filtering process. He hired workers, some of them former slaves, including members of the Green family who had learned the craft alongside him in Dan Call's still house. The question of what role Nearest Green himself played in the new operation remains a matter of historical debate. Some evidence suggests he continued to work as a distiller under Jack Daniel's ownership. Other accounts indicate he established his own farm and distilling operation nearby. What seems clear is that the knowledge Green had imparted to the young Jack Daniel remained central to the whiskey's production, even as the public face of the operation became exclusively white. The years that followed were years of relentless work. Jack Daniel oversaw every aspect of the operation with an attention to detail that became legendary among those who worked for him. He inspected barrels personally. He tasted samples from every batch. He rejected any whiskey that failed to meet his standards, pouring it back into the still to be redistilled or discarding it entirely. The waste was significant. A less scrupulous operator could have sold the rejected product at a lower price or blended it with superior whiskey to stretch his inventory. Jack Daniel refused. The quality of his whiskey was not negotiable. He also began to cultivate something that few distillers of his era considered important: an image. He adopted a distinctive style of dress: a formal knee-length coat, a broad-brimmed planter's hat, a neatly knotted tie that set him apart from the rough-hewn farmers and moonshiners who populated the whiskey trade. He was photographed frequently, always in the same attire, his expression sober and unreadable. The photographs circulated widely, appearing in advertisements and promotional materials that reached far beyond Tennessee. Jack Daniel understood, perhaps instinctively, that he was selling more than whiskey. He was selling a story. And the story required a character at its center, a figure of dignity, discipline, and uncompromising standards. The whiskey found its audience slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. In the years following the war, Jack Daniel's operation grew from a modest country distillery into something more ambitious. He expanded his warehouse capacity. He increased production. He began shipping barrels to Nashville, to Memphis, to markets beyond Tennessee that had never heard of Cave Spring Hollow or the Lincoln County process. The whiskey traveled by wagon over rutted mountain roads, then by rail as the railroad networks expanded through the South. Each barrel that left Moore County carried with it the name of its maker, stamped into the wood, a signature that would become, in time, one of the most recognized marks in American commerce. The recognition that mattered most, however, came from an unexpected source. In 1895, Jack Daniel entered his whiskey in the World's Fair competition held in St. Louis. The fair was a showcase of industrial achievement, a celebration of American progress as the century drew toward its close. Distillers from across the nation submitted their finest products for judging. The competition was fierce, the standards exacting. And when the results were announced, Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey had been awarded a gold medal, the highest honor available. The medal changed everything. It provided validation that no amount of local reputation could match. Jack Daniel had the medal reproduced on his labels, his advertisements, his letterhead. He spoke of it in interviews with the quiet pride of a man who had always known his whiskey was superior and now possessed proof that others agreed. The medal became central to the brand's identity, a symbol of quality that distinguished Jack Daniel's from the hundreds of other whiskeys crowding the American market. More medals followed. A second gold at the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904, international recognition at competitions in Belgium and England. Each award reinforced the narrative that Jack Daniel and his associates worked carefully to construct, a story of uncompromising standards, of traditional methods preserved against the pressures of industrial modernity, of a whiskey that represented something authentic in an age of increasing adulteration and fraud. Yet even as his public reputation grew, Jack Daniel himself remained an enigmatic figure. He never married. He fathered no children, at least none that he acknowledged publicly. The reasons for this lifelong solitude were never explained, never discussed, never addressed in any document or interview that survives. Some who knew him attributed his bachelor status to simple dedication, a man so consumed by his work that he had no time or energy for domestic life. Others whispered of different explanations: a disappointment in love during his youth, a preference for companionship that could not be spoken of in that time and place, a fundamental coldness at the center of his character that made intimacy impossible. The truth, if there was a single truth, died with him. What can be observed from the outside is a pattern of isolation that deepened as the years passed. Jack Daniel lived modestly despite his growing wealth. He maintained a residence in Lynchburg, but spent much of his time at the distillery, arriving before dawn and remaining until after dark. He was generous with his employees, paying wages above the local standard and providing assistance to workers who fell ill or faced hardship. But this generosity existed at a distance. He did not invite confidences. He did not share his own troubles or uncertainties with those around him. The distillery itself became something like a family, the only family, perhaps, that Jack Daniel truly possessed. He surrounded himself with loyal workers, many of whom remained with the operation for decades. He relied increasingly on his nephew Lem Motlow, whom he began training as a successor during the 1890s. Motlow was family by blood, but more importantly, he shared his uncle's temperament: quiet, meticulous, patient. He learned the business as Jack Daniel had once learned it from Nearest Green and Dan Call, through years of observation and practice rather than formal instruction. The question of succession grew more pressing as the century turned. Jack Daniel was entering his 50s, an age that counted as old in that era. He had no direct heirs. The distillery that bore his name would need to continue after his death, or everything he had built would dissolve into memory. He began transferring ownership to Lem Motlow and another nephew, gradually removing himself from the daily operations while retaining the role of figurehead and guardian of quality. The transition was managed with the same care he brought to everything else: slowly, methodically, with attention to details that others might have overlooked. But something else was changing as well. Those who worked closely with Jack Daniel in those years would later recall a shift in his demeanor, a darkening that seemed to settle over him as he aged. He spoke less. He smiled rarely. He spent long hours alone in his office, attending to correspondence and accounts with an intensity that suggested he was searching for something in the numbers, some error, some discrepancy, some threat to the empire he had constructed. The new century arrived with a sense of foreboding that extended far beyond the hollows of Moore County. Across the United States, a movement was gathering strength, a crusade that would, within 2 decades, attempt to eradicate the very industry that Jack Daniel had spent his life building. The temperance movement had existed in various forms since before the Civil War, but by the early 1900s, it had transformed into something more organized, more politically potent, more determined to reshape American society according to its vision of moral purity. The arguments against alcohol were not without merit. Drunkenness was epidemic in many communities. Saloons had become centers of vice and political corruption. Families were destroyed by fathers who drank away their wages while their children went hungry. The temperance advocates documented these harms with relentless precision, building a case that resonated with churches, women's groups, and progressive reformers who saw prohibition as part of a broader project of social improvement. Tennessee became an early battleground. In 1909, the state legislature passed a law prohibiting the manufacture of intoxicating liquors within Tennessee's borders. The law would take effect the following year. Jack Daniel's distillery, the operation he had built over 4 decades, the enterprise that bore his name and embodied his life's work, would be forced to close. The news must have struck like a physical blow, though Jack Daniel left no record of his reaction. He was 60 years old, perhaps 61. His health, never robust, had begun to falter. And now the legal framework that had allowed his business to exist was being dismantled by forces he could neither control nor effectively oppose. The temperance movement cared nothing for gold medals or quality standards. To its adherents, all whiskey was poison, all distillers were merchants of death, and the closure of every still house in America was a victory for civilization. Lem Motlow scrambled to save what could be saved. He explored the possibility of relocating the operation to Missouri or Alabama, states where prohibition had not yet taken hold. He negotiated with distributors and creditors, attempting to maintain relationships that might prove valuable if the political winds shifted. He stockpiled barrels of aging whiskey, betting that the prohibition laws might eventually be repealed and the inventory would regain its value. But Jack Daniel himself seemed to withdraw from these efforts, retreating into a silence that those around him found difficult to interpret. It was during this period of uncertainty that the incident with the safe occurred. The details vary depending on the source, but the essential elements remain consistent. Jack Daniel arrived at his office early one morning, as was his custom. He approached the iron safe, where he kept his most sensitive documents. He attempted to open it, and he could not remember the combination. What happened in that moment? What thoughts passed through his mind? What emotions surged through his body? Can only be imagined. Here was a man who had built his reputation on precision, on control, on the meticulous management of every detail. A man who could recall the specific characteristics of individual barrels aging in his warehouses. A man who had never, in 40 years of operation, allowed a substandard product to leave his distillery. And now he stood before his own safe, unable to perform a task he had performed thousands of times before. The kick was instantaneous. A single explosive motion, born of frustration or rage or something deeper, a rebellion against the failing of his own mind perhaps, or a physical expression of the helplessness he felt as his world contracted around him. His left foot struck the iron door of the safe. The impact was severe. The toe was injured, though the precise nature of the injury, whether a fracture, a laceration, or some combination, was never clearly documented. In the days that followed, Jack Daniel apparently dismissed the wound as trivial. He was not a man who complained of physical discomfort or sought medical attention for minor ailments. The toe was bandaged. He continued his work, but the wound did not heal as it should have. The flesh around the injury grew inflamed. An infection took hold. What physicians of the era would have called blood poisoning, what modern medicine would recognize as sepsis, spreading from a localized bacterial infection. The progression was gradual at first. Weeks passed, then months. The infection persisted despite treatments that were crude by modern standards. The affected area was drained, bandaged, treated with whatever antiseptics were available in rural Tennessee. Nothing worked. The poison crept deeper into his body, moving through tissue and blood with a patience that seemed almost deliberate. By 1906, the situation had become critical. Physicians recommended amputation, the removal of the infected toe, and eventually a portion of the foot itself, in hopes of halting the spread before it reached vital organs. Jack Daniel submitted to the surgery. The amputation was performed, but the infection had already moved beyond the boundaries of what the surgeons could remove. It was in his blood now, circulating through his body, attacking organs and systems that no scalpel could reach. The man who had controlled every aspect of his distillery with such precision found himself at the mercy of a process he could neither manage nor understand. His body was failing, his empire was closing, and the silence that had always surrounded him grew deeper, more impenetrable, as the end approached. The years between the amputation and the end were years of slow diminishment. Jack Daniel, who had once walked the distillery grounds with the purposeful stride of a man who owned everything he surveyed, now moved with difficulty when he moved at all. The loss of part of his foot had altered his gait, his balance, his relationship with the physical world he had mastered for so long. Canes became necessary, then crutches. Eventually, there were days when he could not rise from his chair without assistance. Those who observed him during this period would later speak of a man transformed. The formal attire remained, the long coat, the planter's hat, the carefully knotted tie. But these vestments of authority now hung on a frame that seemed to shrink with each passing month. His face grew gaunt. His eyes, always watchful, took on a quality that some described as haunted. He continued to visit the distillery when his strength permitted, but his presence there had become something closer to ceremony than supervision. The real work of management had passed to Lem Motlow and the other men Jack Daniel had trained over the decades. The distillery itself was winding down. Tennessee's prohibition law had taken effect in 1910, forcing the cessation of whiskey production within the state. The stills that had operated continuously for more than 40 years fell silent. The workers who had spent their lives mastering the craft of distillation found themselves without employment. Some followed Lem Motlow to the facilities he was attempting to establish across state lines. Others drifted away to farms, to factories, to whatever work they could find in a region that had lost one of its primary industries. Jack Daniel watched this dissolution from a distance that was both physical and psychological. He had given the distillery to Motlow and his other nephew several years earlier, relinquishing legal ownership while retaining a kind of spiritual authority over the operation. But what authority could he exercise now? The empire he had built was being dismantled by forces beyond any individual's control. The buildings remained. The springs still flowed cold and pure from the limestone bluff. But the purpose that had animated these places for 4 decades had been stripped away by legislative decree. The infection continued its work. Despite the amputation, despite whatever treatments the physicians of Moore County could provide, the poison in his blood refused to yield. Modern medicine would later understand that such infections, once established in the bloodstream, required antibiotics to defeat, drugs that would not be discovered for another 2 decades. The doctors of 1910 had no such weapons. They could drain abscesses, amputate limbs, prescribe rest and hope. But against sepsis, they were largely helpless. Jack Daniel's world contracted to the dimensions of a sick room. The travels that had once taken him to world's fairs and distant markets ceased entirely. The correspondence that had connected him to distributors and associates across the country slowed to a trickle. Visitors came, family members, former employees, business associates who wished to pay their respects. But their visits grew shorter as his condition deteriorated. There was little to say. The man in the bed bore only a passing resemblance to the figure who had built an empire from nothing, who had won gold medals and constructed a legend that would outlast them all. What passed through his mind during those long hours of confinement, no one can say. He left no diary, no memoir, no record of his inner life during those final months. The silence that had characterized his public persona extended to his private thoughts as well. If he experienced regret over the kick that had set this decline in motion, he did not express it. If he felt anger at the prohibitionists who had destroyed his industry, he kept that anger to himself. If he mourned the life he had not lived, the family he had never created, the intimacies he had never permitted himself, that mourning remained invisible to those around him. Lem Motlow visited regularly, consulting his uncle on matters of business, even when it was clear that Jack Daniel's capacity for such consultations had diminished. These visits served a purpose beyond practical necessity. They maintained a connection to the world Jack Daniel had built, a thread of continuity that prevented him from feeling entirely abandoned by the life he had known. Motlow would later prove himself a worthy successor, steering the brand through the wilderness, years of national prohibition, and positioning it for the resurgence that would come after repeal. But in those final months, his role was simpler: to sit with a dying man, to listen to whatever words emerged from the silence, to bear witness to the end of an era. The autumn of 1911 arrived with its customary chill. The leaves turned in the hollows around Lynchburg, painting the hillsides in shades of gold and crimson. Jack Daniel had always loved this season, the time of harvest and preparation, the gathering of resources against the coming winter. But he would not see another spring. His body, exhausted by years of fighting an enemy it could not defeat, was finally surrendering. The infection had spread too far, damaged too much. The physicians who attended him offered no false hope. They managed his pain as best they could and waited for the inevitable. The end came on the morning of October 10th. Those present in the room, a small gathering of family members and close associates, reported that Jack Daniel passed quietly, without final words or dramatic gestures. The silence that had defined so much of his life accompanied him into death. Whatever secrets he carried, whatever explanations he might have offered for the choices he had made and the life he had lived, went with him into the darkness. The news traveled quickly through Lynchburg. Church bells tolled. Businesses closed their doors as a mark of respect. Men who had worked at the distillery for decades gathered in small groups on street corners and porches, speaking in low voices about the man who had employed them, who had demanded their best efforts and rewarded their loyalty. Women who had known Jack Daniel only as a distant figure of local importance paused in their work to acknowledge the passing of an era. The town that he had helped to build, that existed in many ways, because of the industry he had created, fell into a collective mourning that was genuine, even when it could not fully articulate what had been lost. The funeral was held 2 days later at the Lynchburg Town Cemetery. The procession that accompanied the coffin through the streets included virtually every resident of the town, along with visitors who had traveled from Nashville, Memphis, and beyond. Lem Motlow walked at the head of the mourners, his face set in an expression of controlled grief. The other nephews followed, along with workers from the distillery, business associates, and representatives of the various organizations with which Jack Daniel had been affiliated over the years. The crowd was substantial for such a small community, a testament to the reach of the reputation Jack Daniel had built. The grave site had been selected with care. It occupied a prominent position in the cemetery, marked by a stone that would later be replaced by a more elaborate monument. The service was brief, conducted according to the Protestant traditions of the region. Scripture was read, prayers were offered, and then the coffin was lowered into the Tennessee earth, coming to rest in soil not far from the cave spring that had made everything possible. In the days that followed, the practical matters of death demanded attention. Jack Daniel had been meticulous in his preparations, transferring ownership of the distillery to his nephews well before his final illness. But the business he left behind was not the thriving enterprise it had once been. Tennessee's prohibition law had forced the closure of whiskey production. The warehouses held aging inventory that could not legally be sold within the state. The workers had dispersed. The future of the operation remained deeply uncertain. Lem Motlow assumed control with the quiet determination that had characterized his uncle's approach to business. He explored every available option for continuing production, relocating operations to Missouri, then to Alabama, seeking jurisdictions where the manufacture of whiskey remained legal. He maintained the aging inventory in Tennessee, paying taxes on barrels that generated no revenue, betting that the political climate would eventually shift. He kept the Jack Daniels name alive through whatever channels remained open, refusing to let the brand disappear into the obscurity that claimed so many regional distilleries during the Prohibition years. The questions surrounding Jack Daniels' death persisted long after the funeral flowers had wilted. The story of the safe, the forgotten combination, the impulsive kick, the fatal infection, circulated through Lynchburg and beyond, taking on the characteristics of legend. Some who heard it found in the tale a moral lesson about the dangers of anger, the importance of self-control. Others saw something darker, a man undone by the very qualities that had made him successful, his precision and discipline finally failing him at the worst possible moment. But there were those who questioned whether the story was entirely true. The account rested on no eyewitness testimony. Jack Daniel had been alone in his office when the incident allegedly occurred. The timeline was vague, the medical details imprecise. Some wondered whether the infection might have had another origin entirely, whether the safe story had been constructed after the fact to provide a narrative that obscured more troubling possibilities. A man in his 60s, living alone, suffering from unnamed ailments. There were other explanations for a systemic infection, explanations that the culture of the time would have found difficult to discuss openly. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked away as securely as the contents of that iron safe. Jack Daniel had built his life on discretion, on the careful management of information, on the maintenance of boundaries between his public image and his private reality. In death as in life, he revealed only what he chose to reveal. The rest was silence. The decades that followed Jack Daniel's death would test everything he had built. National prohibition arrived in 1920, extending the ban on alcohol production across the entire country and eliminating even the out-of-state options that Lem Motlow had pursued. The distillery in Cave Spring Hollow fell into disuse. The buildings stood empty, their copper stills cold and silent, their warehouses gradually depleted as the remaining inventory was sold for medicinal purposes or simply aged beyond usefulness. The spring continued to flow from the limestone bluff, but the water that had once been transformed into gold medal whiskey now ran unused into the creek below. Motlow refused to abandon the enterprise. He maintained ownership of the property throughout the Prohibition years, paying taxes on land and buildings that generated no income. He preserved the equipment, the recipes, the accumulated knowledge of decades. He waited, with a patience that would have made his uncle proud, for the political climate to shift. Other distilleries sold their assets, abandoned their brands, disappeared into history. Jack Daniel's survived because one man believed that the name still held value, that the reputation built over 40 years could outlast a constitutional amendment. The repeal came in 1933. Motlow immediately began the process of rebuilding, navigating the complex web of federal and state regulations that governed the newly legal industry. Tennessee itself remained dry, forcing him to lobby the state legislature for permission to resume production in Moore County. The effort took years. It was not until 1938 that whiskey again flowed from the stills at Cave Spring Hollow, 28 years after Jack Daniel's death, 29 years after Tennessee had first shut down the operation. The brand that emerged from this resurrection was both continuous with and distinct from what Jack Daniel had created. The methods remained the same: the cave spring water, the sugar maple charcoal, the patient aging in charred oak barrels. The quality standards that Jack Daniel had enforced with such rigor were maintained by Motlow and his successors. But the scale of the operation expanded dramatically in the post-war years. What had been a regional product, known primarily in the South, became a national and then international phenomenon. The distinctive square bottle, the black and white label, the image of Jack Daniel himself, formal, dignified, enigmatic, became recognizable symbols across the globe. The mythology expanded alongside the business. The story of Jack Daniel's life was told and retold, polished and simplified, until it achieved the smooth consistency of legend. The hard-scrabble childhood, the apprenticeship with Dan Call, the gold medals, the dedication to quality. These elements became fixed in the public imagination, repeated in advertisements and distillery tours, and countless articles celebrating the brand's heritage. The story of the safe and the fatal kick became central to this mythology, offered as evidence of the founder's passionate commitment to his work, his refusal to tolerate even small failures. What the mythology omitted was often as significant as what it included. The role of Nearest Green in developing the techniques that made Jack Daniel's whiskey distinctive went largely unacknowledged for over a century, erased from the official history in ways that reflected the racial attitudes of the era. The questions surrounding Jack Daniel's personal life, his lifelong bachelorhood, his emotional isolation, the private griefs and desires he never expressed, were passed over in silence. The sanitized version of the story presented a man of simple virtues: hard work, quality, authenticity. The more complicated human being, who had actually lived and died in Lynchburg, remained hidden behind the image he had so carefully constructed. The distillery itself became a pilgrimage site. Visitors arrived from across the country and around the world to walk the grounds where Jack Daniel had built his empire, to see the cave spring, to tour the rickyard and the barrel houses. They posed for photographs beside his statue. They visited his grave in the Lynchburg Cemetery, some leaving small offerings of whiskey at the base of the monument. They purchased bottles from the gift shop and carried them home as souvenirs of their encounter with an American legend. Yet the man at the center of all this